Welcome to the Seriously Absurd podcast, where there are no stupid questions, only inquisitive idiots.
Hi, Zax.
Hey, Lab.
What are we here to do?
We're here to talk seriously about an absurd topic. And today I'd like to know, what is the qualification to join the Mile High Club?
Okay, we can do that. So I took the liberty of looking at the Wikipedia article for Mile High Club to see what we're starting for. And it seems the Mile High Club is slang for people who have had sexual intercourse on board an aircraft in flight. Now, the argument I want to make is that, well, that's not good enough for a definition, because there are so many ways to be in flight, and we really need to get at the crux of what it means to be in the Mile High Club and why it's so important to people. Because is it the Mile High Club if you do it on a private jet? Because that has none of the cultural, taboo associated with it. That's a key part of the Mile High Club, and that's the argument I want to make. What are you thinking?
So, the interesting thing, I also consulted the Wikipedia article, and the interesting thing to me is that the first sort of documented case of somebody entering the Mile High Club was actually in a hot air balloon.
Right.
Which is in and of itself a very private and intimate sort of setting.
That's true. It's also very visible from the ground. Balloons in the 1700s didn't get that high off the ground. So you might have been looked upon in a hot air balloon if you were to do that.
Okay.
I think there's something there. We can agree, though, that it's not about being 5,280 feet in the air, above sea level, above ground level, or anything like that. That's not part of it.
Okay. I'm not totally convinced, but
okay.
Sure.
So what about an aircraft? Like, say you're on a normal commercial aircraft in all the stereotypical ways that one would join the Mile High Club in the 21st century. But you're not at 30,000 feet, you're not at a mile high, you're at 200 feet, you're just taking off or you're just landing. Is that the Mile High Club? Does that count, even though you're flying, but you're at a low altitude?
I really don't know. I don't know that I could say.
These are the issues of our time. It's good that we're keeping it real and tackling them. So I'm going to say that it does count, because the crux of the Mile High Club is it's the cultural taboo of having sexual intercourse on an airplane in flight where it's otherwise not something that's supposed to happen. And as a result, I'm going to make the case that it does not count in a private aircraft.
Including a hot air balloon where the first sort of event took place?
I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say the definition of Mile High Club in the current culture in the 21st century has evolved to exclude something like that. Because a Mile High Club is about risk. So looking at this Wikipedia article, they say an alleged explanation for wanting to perform the act is the supposed vibration of the plane, which I don't think is true, because planes are not like unbalanced washing machines. They don't vibrate like that. Some say they have fantasies about pilots or flight attendants, but the actual generally accepted definition of going to the Mile High Club or joining the Mile High Club is not that you have to do it with a pilot or a flight attendant. It's just someone else. So don't believe that. Or they also say a fetish about planes themselves, a type of mechanophilia. And that, I think, is complete bullshit, because how many people who join the Mile High Club actually do so because of a genuine fetish for planes? So I don't think that's why people attempt this. They attempt it because it's a risk.
Okay. So on the subject of risks, are we considering only airplanes, or are we considering any type of aircraft? Could you, in fact, join the Mile High Club in a helicopter?
I think it depends on the size of the aircraft, because the point I keep trying to make is that it's about the risk, it's about the taboo. So if you're on a private aircraft, like a Gulfstream, where let's say the pilot's not around, or the pilot's behind his door, and it's just you and your lover doing that deed, then I don't think that counts, because there's no element of risk, there's no element of particular taboo, it's a private place, you can do what you want. So in that sense, how big is this helicopter? Is it really small, where it's like a private helicopter tour, or is it really big? However, just as I say that, I'm thinking of something else where on normal planes there is a door between the cockpit, and the area in which a deed would be done. But that doesn't really exist on helicopters for the most part. So
Right.
you're sort of involving the pilot, and
The pilot would
that's
necessarily be involved in a helicopter.
yes. So unless the pilot is a very willing participant in this and is like along for the ride and all that, which I guess could happen. I don't think that would count if that were the case. But if it's an otherwise normal pilot who is just happens to be working a group where two people are trying to have sex, then that meets the standard. So the pilot can
Okay.
count as like contributing to this taboo that people are after with joining the Mile High Club.
All right. So what about a hang glider?
Who's on the ground? Is it a hang glider over the ocean or over a remote forest? Or is it, over the city?
Okay. So really the crux of this is the risk of being seen by someone that is not actively participating in what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm getting at. Though when I think about it more in terms of the hang glider, uh, I think there has to be some credit given to the risk because it would be a very impressive feat to join the Mile High Club, or if we're just ignoring the argument, to have intercourse on a hang glider. Hang glider. I can't say that, but there has to be some credit given for that because that's a dangerous act.
Okay. So then going back then to the hot air balloon,
Mm-hmm.
if the hot air balloon is in clear visibility of people on the ground, then it would count?
I think it would. If you're in a glass bottomed hot air balloon, or if you had a low enough altitude to where other people would witness this who are not consenting to witnessing this, then that is counting. Or at least it doesn't have to be witnessed, it just has to be there is a credible risk of being witnessed or being caught.
Okay. So what about unpowered flight? We've talked about airplanes, we've talked about helicopters, gliders are unpowered. What about parachutes? Two people
Parachutes,
in
yeah.
a tandem jump, descending by parachute, having intercourse. Are they in the Mile High Club?
See, under the definition I've been pursuing so far, it's sort of iffy because it's all about, the risk of being seen and, being subject to that taboo of having sex in a place where you're not supposed to have sex. But at the same time, I think credit has to be given for risk of any kind, not specifically the risk of being found out or being witnessed or being, socially ostracized for doing this bad thing. It's could just be the threat of bodily harm, and that's the risk. So I think in that sense, you're joining the Mile High Club because you're taking this risky aviation related act to have sex. So under a parachute counts in that regard.
So realistically, then, what we're really talking about is aerial intercourse. Intercourse off the ground where there is some element of risk, whether it is social risk or physical risk, just risk.
Yes, I think that's a good way of summing it up. It has to be more precise than just off the ground though, because you can't just be on a swing. That's not off the ground. It has to be either lighter than air flight or heavier than air flight, where you are being supported by the air and your motion through it or your interaction with
Right.
it.
So you cannot be tethered to anything which is itself attached to the ground. So, for instance, intercourse while bungee jumping would not count.
No, that would definitely not count. That's a hell of an extreme sport and sounds sort of painful, but no, that would not count for the Mile High Club. And I don't think most reasonable people would assume. If we're trying to make the legal definition, a reasonable person would not believe you've joined the Mile High Club if you had sex while bungee jumping.
Okay. So when we're looking at sort of the spectrum of
Mhm.
what could be considered the Mile High Club, what do you think is the pinnacle achievement of the Mile High Club?
I think the pinnacle achievement of the Mile High Club is the stereotypical Mile High Club, which is where you're on a commercial flight with, 150, 200 other people, and you find a way in that, normally not too private environment to have sex. And usually that means the airplane lavatory. So that is the stereotypical Mile High Club, cannot be disputed. And just to make it even more indisputable, let's say in this scenario, you are completely, you're at 30,000 feet, you're well above a mile, and there's no landing or takeoff or low altitude shenanigans going on here that would interfere with the specific meaning of Mile High Club. That's the stereotype. That is the indisputable case.
Okay, so you would say that the Pinnacle is a commercial flight. I
Yes.
disagree.
What would you think?
I think the Pinnacle is Air Force One.
So, like, I don't think it would count as the president on Air Force One because you have a bedroom.
No.
If
Right,
you're like
president-
a journalist,
Right. If
on
you
Air
were a
Force One.
journalist on Air Force One or a staffer on Air
Yeah.
Force One, and
someone who
you
is
were
not
able to do
entitled
the
to
deed.
privacy.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that makes it a much more exclusive club. Like that might be a
Extremely.
club of. It could be a club of zero. I don't think it's a club of zero, but it might be.
Right.
You think
Now, it doesn't necessarily count as the Pinnacle if you're doing the deed with the president.
Well, no, because then the president's expectation of privacy would apply to you, because the
Exactly.
president has his own bedroom or her own bedroom, maybe, and then they can do in that bedroom what they want with who they want, and
Exactly.
so that definitely doesn't count. I think it would count though if you were with, someone of authority in the command structure of that plane, but who didn't necessarily have a stateroom to themselves. So like a staffer, someone who's like, hey, I know this out of the way area on the lower deck. It's employees only or whatever. It's Secret Service only. And then they take you there. That would count. Because there's still that reasonable, credible risk.
So then another possible candidate would be either suborbital or orbital spaceflight. Is that
That's-
in a totally different class?
I think it's like a rectangle square sort of thing. If you manage to have sex while on a suborbital or orbital spaceflight, then you have not only joined the Mile High Club, you have joined the 100-mile high club. So that's a whole different qualification. But then, if you go through that, you're also going to have to draw the distinction between orbital and suborbital spaceflight. So, Jeff Bezos' rocket gets to 100 kilometers, so like 62, 65 miles, then it falls right back down. You have a very short period of time in which to perform intercourse. Whereas if
True.
you're on, a Dragon capsule or you're on the International Space Station, you will be in orbit. You will be several times higher in altitude. So, and there's a huge technological difference in terms of performing those two acts, just from an engineering perspective. So I think they have to result in different merits that you get if you were able to perform intercourse in either of those two situations.
Right. So there is a possibility that on a suborbital flight, you could qualify for the Mile High Club without qualifying for the 100-mile high club.
Right. That said, we were making the case earlier that the Mile High Club is not necessarily about 5,280 feet above the ground. It could be less.
Right.
If you're at a plane flying at 5,000 feet or 3,000 feet or 200 feet, that's still the same thing. But I don't think that same thing would apply to, let's say, the 100-mile high club, or you could call it the 50-mile high club. So the definition of space is different depending on who you ask. If you ask the US, it's 50 miles. If you ask the rest of the world, it's 62 miles, which is 100 kilometers. So there's a distinction to be made there. But let's say you're indisputably in space. You're at the 100-kilometer club. So nobody's going to argue that you're not in space. But I think you actually have to perform the act above that line in order for it to count. It's a more rigid qualification than just the Mile High Club. The 50-mile high club or the 100-kilometer club actually means 100 kilometers or greater.
Okay. So Mile High Club, sort of fungible definition,
Right.
but the Space High Club, pretty clear line depending on American or European standards.
Yeah, depending on the country in which the act is performed, it could be either 50 miles or it could be 62 miles. And the reason for that is the Mile High Club is just a colloquialism. You say mile high, but no one actually says, 5,280 feet in the air. It's just a metaphor for being airborne. Whereas the Space High Club or the 100 kilometer club, that is a rigid specification that you're qualifying for.
Okay.
So there's a more precise meaning going on.
So for the Mile High Club, you have to be untethered from the ground.
Yes.
You have to be engaged in intercourse.
Yes.
And you have to be engaged in some amount of risk, whether it is physical risk or social risk.
Yes. I think we've reached the crux of it there. There is more debate to be had about what kinds, like we're using this term sexual intercourse. And there's a wide variety of acts that could fit that description. So I think if you want to be more precise, it has to be a penetrative act. Let's go for that.
Could it be an oral penetrative act?
I'm going to say yes, because it's, tying it back to this concept of risk, we're talking about something that is putting you in a compromising position. So something that's leaving you rather exposed, in an anatomical sense. So I think, yes, that would count.
So in terms of the greatest risk, though, what do you think is the greatest level of risk you can engage in this way? Like when I was thinking about the sort of Pinnacle and I proposed Air Force One, I wasn't really thinking about maximum risk. I think maximum risk might be something like spacecraft during launch, where you're pulling 8 Gs. Like,
yeah,
that seems pretty risky.
So are we, we're talking either maximum risk or maximum prestige, because maximum prestige would be Air Force One, and I think that's the point you were getting at. Maximum risk would be a little different. If we're talking about risk of bodily harm, space launching, or I don't know, falling without a parachute where death is just imminent. That's one. That's a special qualification, both for the Mile High Club and for stupidity. So that's something. But I think in terms of like the societal risk that we're talking about, I think that has to be under the blanket in a commercial aircraft. So you're not using the lavatory. You're not in a closed off space. You're not in, a super expensive A380 suite. You're just under blankets and you're relying on the indifference or unawareness of the passengers around you.
And it really has to be, it can't be a small flight either. You have to be in like the middle seat of the middle row on a 747.
Yeah, if you're optimizing for maximum risk, then yes. And that would also mean you're not on a red-eye flight where 90% of people are sleeping and are dead to the world. You're talking about a daytime flight with people all around. People who are aware. They're probably watching a movie or whatever, but they're awake, cognizant. They can see what's going on around them.
Right. Okay, so a daytime, highly populated flight in the middle of the aircraft, in the middle row, doing the deed. Under a blanket.
Yeah. And I do think the blanket is important, because if you're doing it overtly, like it's an exhibitionist act, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, then that's something different, because that's not risk. You're actually just going out with it, which is not the point. Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
Okay. I think we've done a valuable service to the world here. We've determined the qualifications, the maximums, the minimums, the possible extensions to the concept of the Mile High Club.
I agree. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Zax.
Thank you, Lab. Thank you for joining us on this week's episode of the Seriously Absurd podcast. Please come back again next week for a discussion about grocery stores.